Sometimes God uses the most unexpected voices to reach our hearts. Not the preachers in pulpits or the prophets with microphones, but a child, innocent and pure. That's what happened to Grace Thompson, a mother from Virginia whose 12-year-old daughter Abigail had an experience that would shake her world. Grace stood before the camera one quiet evening, her hands trembling, her eyes full of both fear and faith. "Please listen," she said softly. "Pray, forgive, love, and prepare your heart." You could hear the urgency in her voice, not the urgency of panic, but of purpose. She wasn't speaking for attention. She was speaking because love demanded it. And isn't that how God often works? He takes what seems ordinary, a mother's voice, a child's dream, and fills it with a divine message. Grace said that since that night, every evening before bed, Abigail would hold her hand and whisper, "Mom, I hope they're listening." That simple line pierced her soul. You could almost feel heaven leaning close through that little girl's voice, pleading for people to wake up. Grace confessed that she wrestled with sharing the story. She prayed, asking, "Lord, is this really you? Is this for me or for the world?" But deep down, she knew this wasn't just another bedtime story. It was a call to believers everywhere. And when God gives you a message to carry, silence becomes disobedience. What moves me most is that her words didn't come from fear, they came from compassion. She wasn't warning people to scare them, but to prepare them. She wanted hearts to soften, families to forgive, faith to be rekindled. Maybe that's what God is still whispering to us today. Come back to me. Don't wait for tragedy to remind you of eternity. Sometimes it takes a voice of innocence to shake the noise out of our hearts. Grace's story reminds me that God still speaks in our generation through dreams, through children, through the quiet moments we too often rush past. And maybe He's asking you right now to slow down and listen, because the message hasn't changed. Pray, forgive, love, prepare your heart. The time to turn back to Him isn't tomorrow, it's today. It was an ordinary evening in Virginia, the 8th of October 2025, a night that started with peace and ended with a miracle. Grace Thompson and her 2 children had just finished their family devotion. They sang, they prayed, they thanked God for another day. Everything seemed normal, the kind of night you take for granted because nothing feels out of place. Abigail, her 12-year-old daughter, ran upstairs to grab her little Bible storybook she'd forgotten. But in a split second, life changed. As she turned to come down, her younger brother called her name, just a playful distraction, and Abigail missed a step. It was one of those moments that seem harmless until you realize they're not. She fell, hit the ground, and suddenly everything went still. No movement. No response. Grace rushed over, her heart pounding, calling her daughter's name again and again. "Abigail, Abby." But there was no answer. Panic filled the room. They called for help, tears mixing with prayer, hope fighting fear. At the hospital, doctors did everything they could. Wires, monitors, voices, calling orders. And then those words no parent ever wants to hear. She has no pulse. Minutes felt like hours. Faith wrestled with reality, and Grace stood there frozen, whispering, "God, please, not my little girl." Maybe you've had a moment like that where your strength isn't enough, where all you can do is hold on to a prayer. The room was filled with chaos, but somewhere above the noise, heaven was moving. After what felt like forever, Abigail gasped. One breath, one heartbeat, life again. And right there in that sterile hospital room, the supernatural met the natural. Grace didn't see lightning or hear thunder, but she felt something powerful, a peace that words can't describe. Abigail opened her eyes, not with fear, but with tears, like someone who had seen something far beyond this world. Her first words weren't "what happened" or "where am I?" but something that froze her mother in place. "Mom, Why was I not on earth anymore? In that moment, Grace knew this wasn't just a faint or a fall. Something divine had touched her daughter's life. You see, sometimes God allows interruptions not to harm us, but to awaken us. That fall wasn't an accident, it was an assignment. Out of what looked like loss came revelation. Out of silence came a voice. Friends, life can turn in an instant. One moment you're standing, the next you're falling, but never think the fall is the end of your story. God can bring life where there's no pulse, light where there's darkness, purpose out of pain. Abigail's story reminds us that even when everything goes still, heaven is still working. And sometimes that one breath back is the beginning of something that will shake the world. When Abigail opened her eyes, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. The monitors were still beeping, nurses whispering, doctors watching closely, but to her mother, Grace, all of that faded into the background. Because in that moment, life had just returned to her little girl. Grace reached out, tears flooding her eyes, whispering, "You're back, sweetheart. You're back." But Abigail didn't respond the way you'd expect. She didn't ask what happened or where she was. Instead, she looked right into her mother's eyes, calm but distant, and said softly, "Mom, why was I not on earth anymore?" Those words hit Grace like thunder. She felt a chill move through her body because she knew this wasn't just a fainting spell or a dream. Something greater had taken place. Abigail had seen something her young mind could barely comprehend. I think about that moment often, how God can take a scene that looks like tragedy and turn it into revelation. Sometimes the most sacred moments come dressed as confusion. Grace didn't understand what her daughter meant at first. How could she? But deep down she felt it. This was holy ground. She held Abigail's hand, trembling, realizing that her little girl had stepped somewhere human words couldn't describe and come back with eyes that had seen eternity. Friends, I believe God still moves like that today. He still chooses the unlikely messengers, the quiet ones, the young ones, to remind the world that heaven is not a myth. As the days went by, Abigail spoke gently, slowly, like someone carrying memories too heavy for a child to hold. She would pause, close her eyes, and tears would roll down her cheeks as she tried to describe what she saw. Grace said her daughter didn't speak like a child remembering a dream. She spoke like a witness, someone who had walked through a realm that felt more real than earth. Isn't it amazing how God sometimes lets us glimpse beyond the veil, not to scare us, but to prepare us? He doesn't always give explanations. He gives experiences that change how we see everything. Grace later said that from that day forward, she could no longer pray the same way. Every thank you felt deeper. Every Lord help me carried new meaning. Because she realized life is fragile, but heaven is closer than we think. Abigail's question still echoes. Mom, why was I not on earth anymore? Maybe that's a question meant for all of us, to remind us that there's more to this life than what we see, more purpose in every breath we take. Sometimes God brings someone back not just to heal a body, but to wake a generation. Abigail said that when she opened her eyes, she wasn't in the hospital. She wasn't even on earth. She found herself standing in a place that words can barely describe, endless, white, radiant light stretching farther than her eyes could see. There was no sun, yet everything glowed with warmth. There were no walls, no buildings, no sound, just peace. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of presence. You could almost feel heaven breathing. She said it felt as though she was standing on light itself, soft beneath her feet, alive, sacred. And right there, in that stillness, she knew she wasn't dreaming. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't alive the way she knew life either. She was somewhere in between heaven and earth, between what's seen and unseen. When Grace heard her daughter speak those words, she said it was like time stopped. How could a 12-year-old describe something so profound, so pure? Abigail said she tried to call out, but no words came. Yet somehow she understood everything. There was no need for speech because every thought, every feeling was shared perfectly, heart to heart. That's how heaven communicates, through knowing, not speaking. And maybe that's what God is showing us, that true connection isn't made through noise, but through understanding. We spend so much of life talking, explaining, defending, but in His presence you don't have to say a word. He already knows. As Abigail stood there, she felt a deep calm cover her. No fear, no confusion, just a peace that told her she was known and loved. She said it was strange, but she didn't think of time. There were no minutes, no hours, just eternity flowing like light itself. I think about that sometimes. How many of us rush through days chasing deadlines, forgetting that heaven doesn't run on clocks? Maybe that's why God sometimes pauses our world to remind us that eternity isn't somewhere we go. It's something He carries inside of us. Grace said that when Abigail told her all this, she could see a glow in her daughter's eyes, something gentle but powerful. It was as if a piece of that other world had followed her back. And maybe that's the lesson in her story, that there's more beyond this life than we could ever imagine. There's a realm where words aren't needed, where peace replaces fear and love fills the air like light. Abigail stood in that place, just for a moment, between heaven and earth, and came back to remind us all that what's invisible is not unreal. Sometimes the space between two worlds is thinner than we think, and in that stillness, heaven whispers, "You were never alone." Abigail said that as she stood in that vast, white expanse, something began to change. Far in the distance, she saw colors, bright, beautiful colors, emerging from the light. As she walked closer, she realized they weren't just colors, they were flags, hundreds of them, stretching across the endless plain. Each one rested on a glowing square, separated by thin golden lines that shimmered like fire. The sight was breathtaking, nations laid out before heaven's eyes. She didn't need anyone to explain it. Somehow, she just knew what she was looking at were the nations of the world, every tribe, every people, every land, seen not through human eyes, but through the eyes of eternity. Then everything went still. The air, the light, even the ground beneath her seemed to hold its breath. From above, a radiant light began to descend, and as it drew nearer, it took the form of a being, an angel, tall and clothed in garments that gleamed like polished silver. Abigail said his presence wasn't frightening, but powerful, pure, and purposeful. She could feel that this messenger had come with an assignment. He didn't speak, yet every movement carried meaning deeper than words. Slowly, the angel began to move among the flags. One by one, he lifted them gently into the air, and as each one rose, the square beneath it burst into white light before fading into stillness again. Abigail said she watched in awe as flag after flag was lifted, countries she recognized, others she didn't, but with each one, she sensed something holy happening. It wasn't just cloth being lifted, it was destiny being weighed, purposes being revealed. And as she stood there, she felt a deep realization sink into her heart. Heaven sees nations differently than we do. We see borders, politics, and pride. God sees hearts, prayers, and promises. He doesn't measure a country by its wealth or power, but by its obedience, its compassion, its faithfulness. Maybe that's what this vision was really about, a reminder that nations matter to God, that our world isn't spinning out of His control, and that in every land His hand is still moving. When Abigail described it later, her mother Grace said she could feel the weight of it, as if God Himself was revealing a glimpse of His plan for humanity. The angel continued lifting the flags, light filling the air, until only a few were left untouched. And in that moment, Abigail felt it in her spirit. Something was about to be revealed, something heaven had been preparing to show. You see, friends, sometimes God allows us a glimpse of what He's doing behind the scenes, not to make us afraid, but to remind us that He's still in charge. While the world argues and nations rise and fall, heaven remains steady. The same God who holds the stars in place still holds the nations in his hand. And one day, every flag, every people, every heart will bow before the same light. Abigail saw his light, his glory, his eternal plan. When the angel reached the flag of Nigeria, Abigail said something and the atmosphere shifted. The peace she had felt moments earlier grew heavy, almost sorrowful. As the angel's radiant hand lifted that flag, the ground beneath it turned red thick, living blood spreading in every direction. Abigail said it wasn't a trick of light or imagination. It was real, it was alive, and it carried a weight she couldn't explain. Then, like a vision within a vision, she began to see images unfolding before her eyes, villages burning, families running, believers crying out in prayer while danger closed in around them. She saw churches in flames, men and women clutching Bibles as soldiers and mobs surrounded them. And yet, even in that chaos, she said their lips were still moving, whispering, "Jesus, we trust you." Grace, listening to her daughter recount this, wept, because Abigail didn't just see pain, she felt it. She said the cries reached the heavens, and in that moment she realized heaven had been listening all along. The persecution of God's people was not forgotten. It had been recorded, every tear, every prayer, every act of faith under fire. Then, from above, Abigail saw something extraordinary. The light changed, and 3 powerful angels descended from the sky, their robes flowing like rivers of gold, brighter than the sun. The moment their feet touched the ground, the noise of suffering stopped. She said she didn't hear them speak, but something deep within her spirit understood the time of justice had come. The first angel lifted what looked like a glowing calendar. Abigail saw the month of October 2025. Every day was filled with light until the 23rd. After that, the dates were blank, empty, waiting. And in her heart, she knew those were the days heaven had set apart, the time when divine justice would begin to move across Nigeria. It wouldn't come through politics or armies, but through the power of God himself. She saw the blood on the ground begin to dry, turning clear like water, then disappearing completely. The land that had been soaked in pain was being cleansed. You see, friends, God never overlooks injustice. We may not understand the timing, but his timing is perfect. When you've cried and it seemed heaven was silent, remember, delay is not denial. Sometimes he waits until the appointed day, when everything hidden will be exposed, and every wound will be healed. Abigail's vision reminds us that the same God who saw the suffering of his people in Egypt still sees his people today. The blood cried out for justice, and heaven answered. And maybe that's what he's whispering to all of us right now. Don't give up. The light will return, the pain will pass, and when God moves, he moves to restore, to redeem, and to remind us that he never forgets his own. When the angel turned toward the flag of the United States, Abigail said she felt a strange uneasiness in the air. It wasn't fear, it was the kind of quiet before a storm, when heaven itself seems to hold its breath. As the angel lifted the flag, she expected to see something like what she'd seen under the others: blood, fire, light, but instead she saw movement. The ground beneath the flag began to stir, and out from it came thousands of worms, crawling in every direction. She said they were small but restless, moving as if they had been hiding for a long time and were now being forced into the open. The sight made her heart race, but deep inside, she understood it wasn't just about worms, it was about truth. She said it was revealed to her that these worms represented what had been hidden in the nation: corruption, lies, secret agendas, deception buried deep within systems and hearts. It wasn't just about politics or leaders, it was about the soul of a nation that had drifted from truth. Abigail said she could feel God's grief, not anger but sorrow, that the country he had blessed so richly had allowed darkness to grow beneath its surface. And yet, she also felt something else, mercy. Because the light that reveals is also the light that heals. She saw beams of light descending from heaven, shining directly on those worms. And wherever the light touched, they began to dissolve, one after another, until the ground became clean again. Friends, that's what happens when God begins to uncover what's been hidden. It may be uncomfortable. It may shake things up. But exposure is never for destruction, it's for restoration. God doesn't reveal to humiliate, He reveals to heal. Maybe you've had moments in your own life when truth came to the surface, when something you tried to bury was suddenly brought to light. It can feel painful, but don't run from it. The same light that exposes what's wrong also brings freedom, forgiveness, and a new beginning. Abigail said, "The angel kept the flag of America lifted in the air for a long time, and she knew it was a message, that God's hand was still over the nation, but the time had come for truth to shine." She felt in her heart that this cleansing, this uncovering, would begin around the same time she saw on the calendar after the 23rd of October 2025. It would not be a time of destruction, but of awakening. And I believe that too. Sometimes God has to shake a nation to save it. He turns over the soil to uproot what's rotten so that something new can grow. It's never too late for redemption. The same God who lifts the veil does it not to condemn, but to remind us that His light still conquers darkness, and that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. When the angel turned toward the flag of India, Abigail said she felt something shift in the atmosphere this time, not sorrow or fear, but joy. The moment the angel's hand touched the flag, light burst from beneath it, flooding the white plain with color and sound. She said it was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. The ground itself seemed to sing. Voices rose from every direction, men, women, and even children praising God with all their hearts. Some were in small rooms, some in crowded streets, some in hidden places underground, but their songs all joined together like one great river of worship flowing toward heaven. Abigail said it was as if the nation itself had found its voice again. She saw faces glowing in the light, hands lifted high, and tears of joy falling like rain, and she understood that what she was witnessing was revival, pure, unstoppable, heaven-sent revival. Not something orchestrated by people, not a campaign or a movement, but a visitation of God's Spirit sweeping across India. She said it started quietly, like a whisper, but it grew stronger and louder until it became a fire that couldn't be contained. This wasn't a fire that burned to destroy, it burned to ignite hearts, to awaken souls, to bring life where there had been dryness. Abigail saw miracles happening in secret places, blind eyes opening, the sick rising, children preaching with voices filled with boldness and light. She saw people from other religions turning toward Jesus with tears streaming down their faces. She saw underground churches that had hidden in fear now shining like beacons of hope. And she said she could feel the joy of heaven watching over it all, a joy so deep, so pure, that it made her cry even as she spoke about it. Friends, that's what revival looks like. It's not about crowds or stages or fame. It's about hearts catching fire again. It's when the presence of God becomes so real that walls crumble, differences fade, and people who once hid their faith start declaring it with courage. Abigail said, "The angel smiled for the first time when he looked upon that light. And I believe that smile said everything, that heaven delights when people return to God, when praise rises from the ashes, when faith comes alive again." She knew in her heart that this awakening would begin around the same time she saw marked on the heavenly calendar after the 23rd of October 2025. And I can't help but think, what if that same spirit that swept across that vision is preparing to move even now, not just in India, but in every nation, every home, every heart that's willing to say, "Lord, Start with me, because revival doesn't begin with a crowd, it begins with one surrendered heart catching fire. And when that happens, the whole world starts to glow. As the vision faded, Abigail said she felt something like a wind, gentle but strong, pulling her backward. The light around her began to dim, the music grew faint, and for a moment, she didn't want to leave. She said, it felt like leaving peace itself, but the wind grew stronger, and suddenly, she was falling not in fear, but in surrender. Then came the sound of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, voices calling her name, and in an instant she opened her eyes. Her mother was there, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "You're back, my baby." Abigail smiled faintly and whispered, "Mom, I saw heaven's warning." Those 5 words changed everything. Grace said time seemed to stand still. She looked into her daughter's eyes and saw something new, something holy. It wasn't the look of a child waking from a dream. It was the look of someone who had seen eternity and carried a piece of it back with her. Grace knew right then that this was real. It wasn't imagination or illusion, it was divine appointment. Abigail had gone where most hearts only dream of going and returned to tell the world what heaven wanted them to know. You see, sometimes God gives us glimpses beyond the veil, not to make us afraid, but to awaken us. He reminds us that life is more fragile than we think, but also more eternal than we can imagine. Maybe you've had moments like that where you came close to losing something or someone, and it changed how you saw everything. You started valuing time differently, forgiving faster, loving deeper. That's what happened to Grace. From that day, she said, every prayer felt alive. Every sunrise felt like grace renewed. Abigail's return wasn't just a miracle of survival, it was a message of mercy. Heaven had something to say, and it chose a child to say it. And isn't that just like God? He uses the humble, the pure, the unexpected to remind us that He's still near, still speaking, still calling hearts back to Him. As Grace watched her daughter recover, she realized this wasn't the end of a frightening story, it was the beginning of a divine calling. And I think about that often, how what feels like an ending to us can be the very moment heaven begins to write a new chapter. Sometimes the miracle isn't that we escape the storm, it's that we come back from it changed, awake, carrying light we didn't have before. Abigail came back with that light. And maybe, just maybe, she came back to remind us all it's time to listen. Heaven is still speaking. When Grace finished telling her daughter's story, she didn't speak like someone who had just shared a miracle. She spoke like someone carrying a message from heaven itself. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with conviction. "Brothers and sisters," she said, "the time is shorter than we think." You could hear the weight in her tone, the urgency of a mother who had seen something no parent ever expects to witness. She wasn't just asking people to believe her, she was pleading for hearts to awaken. She said what Abigail saw wasn't just for Nigeria or America or India, it was for the whole world. Because persecution, exposure, and revival are not distant events, they're signs that heaven is stirring, calling God's people to return. Grace said, "Pray for your nation, pray for your church, pray for the world." Not the kind of prayer that's rushed or routine, but the kind that comes from a heart desperate for God's presence again. She reminded everyone that this isn't the time to argue, to divide, or to point fingers. This is the time to forgive, to love, to rebuild faith where it's been broken. She said, "We can't keep waiting for someone else to change first. It has to start with us." And isn't that true for all of us? Sometimes we pray for revival to come to our country, but maybe God is waiting for revival to start inside our own hearts. She reminded believers that the coming days would test everyone's faith, not with comfort but with conviction, not with ease but with endurance. And only those who walk closely with God, those who listen when He whispers, who obey when no one is watching, will stand firm when the storms come. Grace said, "Don't wait until tomorrow to get right with God. Don't wait for tragedy to make you pray again, because tomorrow is never promised, but grace is always available." Friends, I think that's a message for every one of us today. Maybe the world looks uncertain. Maybe you're seeing things shaking around you, systems falling, truths being exposed, hearts growing cold. But don't let fear take root. These aren't signs that God has left us. They're signs that He's moving. He's cleansing, realigning, preparing His people for what's ahead. Grace ended her message with a quiet smile and said, "He still saves, He still forgives, He still calls us by name." And I believe that's true. No matter where you are today, no matter how far you've drifted, His arms are still open. The same God who brought Abigail back to life is still breathing life into broken hearts and weary souls. So don't harden your heart. The call is clear. It's time to pray, to forgive, to return, and to stand ready when heaven's light breaks through the darkness.